She was walking along a path with her son when they stumbled upon a strange structure deep in the forest. At first, she was frightened by whoever had built it. But what this person told them later turned their lives upside down. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. Lauren Miller had always believed that exhaustion had a particular sound. It wasn't the buzzing of fluorescent hospital lamps or the hum of life support machines she heard during her night shifts. It wasn't even the steady beep of monitors or the shuffle of rubber soles down the polished hallway. The sound of true exhaustion was silence. The moment she closed the door of her small apartment in the Seattle suburbs and realized that she did not have the strength to speak, laugh, or even explain to her 8-year-old son why she had missed dinner again. Silence, she thought, could feel heavier than noise, especially when you carried it alone. It was that silence that pushed her into the idea of taking Cody to the woods. She woke one morning after an especially long shift, still in her scrubs, the dawn light just beginning to brighten the blinds. Cody was asleep on the couch, wrapped in a blanket he'd dragged there because he wanted to wait for her, though he had, as always, fallen asleep long before she arrived home. She stood watching him for a long moment. His small hands were curled near his chin, his hair messy from sleep, his sketchbook lying open beside him. On the page he had drawn a tall creature made of shadows, long arms, stooped posture, huge feet. Bigfoot again. He'd been obsessed for months. She realized as she looked at him that she didn't even remember the last time they had spent a full day together without screens, school, work, and exhaustion between them. There had been birthdays, holidays, but those were always crowded with relatives or obligations. There had not been a simple day just mother and son following a creek or roasting marshmallows or talking about things that mattered only to them. Suddenly, fiercely, she wanted that. She wanted to hear his voice ask questions that weren't hurried. She wanted to see him smile without glancing at the clock. And she wanted, more than anything, to shake off the sense that motherhood was slipping through her fingers like sand. So she planned the trip. Not far, just a weekend in the Cascades, the kind of hike families took all the time. She'd found a trail that promised quiet views, a small creek, and a campground that wasn't too crowded. "No phones," she announced. Cody's eyes widened in alarm, then curiosity. "Even yours?" he asked, half joking. "Especially mine," she said. He grinned in a way she hadn't seen in months. Packing wasn't complicated. Warm clothing, a tent, a small stove, a blanket Cody insisted on bringing because it felt like home, a first aid kit she packed automatically from habit. Cody packed his sketchbook, a small worn pencil case, a pocket flashlight, and a toy compass he insisted was real. As they loaded the car, he asked whether they might find Bigfoot. Lauren laughed, ruffling his hair. "We might find a lot of things. Maybe not Bigfoot, but maybe something just as good." She didn't know yet what that meant. The drive out of Seattle felt like a slow unspooling of tension. The urban edges softened behind them, replaced by rolling hills, evergreen forests, and the deep green silence of the Pacific Northwest. The closer they came to the trailhead, the more Lauren felt something loosening in her chest, something she hadn't realized was clenched. Cody talked nearly non-stop, narrating passing trees, asking about animals, suggesting where Bigfoot might hide. Lauren answered, not with the distracted half-responses she sometimes gave after work, but with interest, even amusement. She felt almost like herself, someone she hadn't been in a long time. They reached the trailhead before noon. The air was crisp and smelled of pine and cold earth. The parking lot was mostly empty, just 2 other cars, and the forest greeted them with a soft hush, as though it were waiting. They began their hike along a wide, well-marked trail. Sunlight filtered through branches in bright, warm patches. Birds flitted between the trees. Cody ran a little ahead, but never too far, stopping to examine pine cones, rocks, animal tracks in the mud. He pointed out a long line of tiny footprints, probably squirrel, and announced with immense seriousness that it could also be a very small Bigfoot baby. Lauren laughed harder than she expected. They stopped for lunch near a fallen log, where the creek made a gentle bend and sang over stones polished smooth. Cody drew the scene in his sketchbook, while Lauren watched the water move. It felt peaceful, like something she had forgotten was possible. After lunch, they continued, the trail curving deeper into the forest, becoming narrower, quieter, more intimate. The tall pines closed around them, the ground soft with needles. Hours passed easily. Cody's questions floated through the air, and Lauren answered them as though she'd been waiting her whole life for this conversation. But at some point, they drifted farther along a side trail than she realized. It happened subtly, almost naturally. Cody saw an interesting rock formation and wanted to explore. She followed him around a bend. The wide trail narrowed into something less trodden. She expected it to widen again, to meet the main route, but it didn't. Instead, it sloped downward into thicker undergrowth, where sunlight struggled to reach the ground. Lauren hesitated. She looked behind them, as though expecting to see the main path just a few feet away. Instead, she saw only pines and shadows and their own footprints in the soft dirt. She didn't want to worry Cody, so she said lightly, "We'll loop around. All trails connect eventually." Cody was thrilled. "We're really exploring now," he said. "Maybe this is where Bigfoot goes. He wouldn't stay near the main trail. Too many people." He bent down to examine a broken branch. This could be a sign. Lauren felt a twinge of unease but kept moving. The forest here was different, quieter, darker, the air cooler. The ground felt springy under her boots, thick with moss. Several times she thought she recognized a landmark only to realize she didn't. A faint worry curled at the edge of her thoughts. Then Cody stopped suddenly. He pointed between two large trees. "Mom, what is that?" Lauren followed his gaze. At first she saw only branches and shadows, but as her eyes adjusted, she noticed an unnatural shape, straight lines, where nature rarely made them. They stepped closer. The structure emerged from the tangle of vegetation, like something that didn't belong to the century they lived in. Thick branches woven together formed walls reinforced with old, rusted barbed wire. The roof was layered with needles and sticks, arranged deliberately. The entrance was low, set in the front wall, and partially covered by fresh-looking evergreen boughs. Lauren felt her pulse quicken. This wasn't an old hunter's shack. It wasn't a child's fort. It looked too intentional, too solid, too close to something dangerous. Cody whispered, his voice trembling with awe and fear. "Mom, is it a trap? For animals? Or for Bigfoot?" She didn't know what to say. The idea of a trap for a legendary creature should have been absurd, but standing before this strange construction, deep in the forest, where few people wandered, she wasn't sure what to think. She stepped closer, instinctively placing her hand on Cody's shoulder, ready to pull him back. The forest around them was silent. Not the normal soft silence of trees and wind, but a heavier kind, as though holding its breath. A branch snapped behind them. Lauren spun around, pulling Cody behind her. Her heartbeat surged into her throat. From between the trees stepped a man tall, weathered, his beard streaked with gray. He wore a battered flannel shirt beneath a faded vest, heavy boots coated with mud, and the expression of someone who had spent years navigating the wilderness. He raised his hands slowly, palms open. "It's not a trap," he said. His voice was rough but calm, as though he didn't want to startle them. "Don't worry, it's just a blind. My blind." Lauren didn't move. She kept her body slightly angled between him and Cody, every instinct sharpened. The man looked at the structure, then at them, and gave a faint, tired smile. "My name's Earl Thompson," he said. "I live out here. Didn't mean to scare you. Got a cabin nearby." Cody peeked around Lauren's arm, staring at the man with wide, curious eyes. Earl nodded toward the structure. "Just a place to watch from. These woods have stories, and I try to listen to them." Lauren swallowed, unsure. They were deep in unknown woods, with a stranger who lived alone. She didn't feel threatened, but she didn't feel safe yet either. Earl seemed to notice her hesitation. He lowered his hands and softened his voice. "You two look cold," he said, "and tired. My cabin's warm. Got hot cocoa, if the young man likes it. And tea for you, if you'd care for some." Lauren glanced at Cody. His eyes were shining, not with fear, but with excitement, adventure, wonder. She took a breath. The forest felt larger than ever around them, the shadows deeper, the distance back to the trail uncertain. Maybe the safest choice was the one that didn't feel instinctively dangerous. "Just for a little while," she said quietly. Earl nodded once, gently, almost gratefully. "Follow me," he said, and as they stepped behind him into the deepening woods, the day that had begun as a simple hike softened into something stranger, something quieter, something that neither Lauren nor Cody yet understood. But the moment they crossed the threshold of that unmarked path, their lives began to shift. Slowly, gently, toward someone whose presence would change everything that came after. Earl walked ahead of them with a pace that was careful rather than rushed, as though he knew every root and stone that might catch on a boot. Lauren followed several steps behind, keeping Cody close, her hand lightly touching his shoulder whenever the ground dipped or the moss was slick enough to shift beneath their weight. The forest around them had changed again. It was no longer the wide, bright space of the marked trail where sunlight fell generously through high canopies. Here the pines grew closer together, their trunks straight and tall, like silent guardians. The air felt denser, filled with the scent of pine resin and damp earth. Underfoot, the carpet of needles muffled their steps until the only sounds were those of their own breathing, the faint clap of Earl's boots, and the occasional drop of water falling from a branch overhead. The world seemed to narrow into the path before them, a trail that didn't appear on any map Lauren had checked. Earl glanced back from time to time, offering a reassuring nod that somehow did little to calm her nerves. Yet his movements were unthreatening, almost gentle in their predictability. He didn't crowd them or insist on talking, as some people did to ease tension. Instead, he seemed to let the forest speak for him, stepping aside when a low branch dipped overhead, pausing to steady a moss-covered rock so Lauren and Cody could cross without slipping. He behaved not like someone leading strangers into danger, but like a man accustomed to guiding hikers through landscapes he respected. Cody seemed completely at ease. The earlier tension washed from his face. His attention flicked from tree to tree, noticing mushrooms in the undergrowth, the occasional squirrel darting across their path, a bird that burst from a branch with a startled cry. More than once he whispered to Lauren that he wished he could draw everything he saw, but he didn't want to slow them down. She squeezed his hand each time, grateful for the simple wonder glowing in him. It was the kind of brightness she'd feared her long hours and exhaustion had dimmed more than she realized. The path they followed curved gently through the woods before finally widening, opening into a clearing so sudden it felt like stepping from one world into another. The trees here gave way to a small circle of open space, and in its center stood Earl's cabin. It was built from thick logs stacked neatly atop one another, the wood darkened with age and rain but still sturdy. A metal chimney pipe rose from the roof, releasing a thin twist of smoke that curled upward and dissolved into the pale sky. The cabin had a small porch with 2 wooden steps leading to a door that looked handmade, its surface worn smooth by years of use. Beside the door hung a lantern, and next to it, a bundle of dried herbs tied with rough twine. Lauren felt something loosen in her chest when she saw it. It didn't resemble a hideout or a bunker, nothing strange or threatening. It looked lived in old but cared for, functional in a way that suggested the presence of routine and the comfort of solitude rather than menace. A weathered wooden chair sat at one corner of the porch, and a pile of chopped firewood was stacked neatly beneath a small overhang. Whoever lived here wasn't reckless or wild. He was deliberate. "This is it," Earl said quietly as he reached the steps and gestured toward the door. "Come inside, it'll be warmer." When he opened the door, a wave of heat rolled out, soft and inviting. Lauren followed Cody across the threshold, breathing in a mixture of wood smoke, pine, and something faintly sweet. Perhaps tea, or the remnants of an earlier meal. The interior of the cabin was dim at first, lit by the yellow glow of a lantern, and the low light from the fireplace set into the far wall. As her eyes adjusted, she began to take in the room slowly, detail by detail. It was small, but not cramped. The walls were lined with shelves made of rough, unfinished wood, each filled with objects that seemed to form a language of their own. There were hand-drawn maps of the forest, each marked with tiny symbols and notes in neat handwriting. Newspaper clippings pinned with thin nails featured headlines about unexplained sightings, strange footprints, and unusual calls heard deep in the mountains. There were sketches pinned beside them, mostly animals, but some shapes that were larger, rougher, more ambiguous. On a side table sat a stack of well-worn notebooks, their corners bent, pages sticking out unevenly. A pair of binoculars hung from a wooden peg near the window. In the corner, on a small platform, lay a folded sleeping bag and a blanket patterned with faded red stripes. On another wall, carefully arranged in rows, stood small wooden figurines. Some were carved into shapes of bears or deer. Others resembled human figures with long limbs and exaggerated feet. They were sanded smooth and stained a dark brown that caught the flicker of the firelight. Cody froze, staring at them in awe. "Did you make all of those?" he asked, barely above a whisper. Earl smiled, his expression softening in a way that made him look years younger. "Most of them. Keeps my hands busy when the nights get long." "It's amazing," Cody murmured. Lauren couldn't tell if he meant the carvings or the room itself. Perhaps both. Sit," Earl urged, motioning toward a pair of chairs positioned near the fire. "You've been walking a while. Let me get something warm for you." Lauren sat slowly, feeling the tension unwind from her shoulders as the heat from the fire seeped through her jacket. Cody perched on the edge of his chair, glancing around eagerly, his gaze darting from one object to the next. Earl moved with practiced ease, lighting a small kettle on a metal rack near the fire. The clink of metal, the quiet pop of the flames, and the subtle hum of the kettle warming filled the room with a domestic rhythm that felt reassuring. He set out 2 mismatched mugs, one blue, one white with a faded pattern of pine trees, and filled them with cocoa once the kettle steamed. The warm smell wafted through the room, rich and comforting. He handed the blue mug to Cody, who nearly dropped it in his excitement, and the white one to Lauren. She wrapped her fingers around the mug, letting its heat soak into her palms. The warmth eased something inside her she hadn't realized was cold. She took a cautious sip. It was simple cocoa, not too sweet, the kind that reminded her of childhood winters when her mother would warm milk on the stove. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Of course," Earl replied. He sank into a wooden chair opposite theirs, resting his elbows on his knees. "It's not often I have visitors. especially not folks who come this far off the trail. Lauren hesitated. We didn't mean to wander this deep. We must have taken a wrong turn. Most people do, Earl said. The forest has a way of pulling you in if you're not watching your feet. Cody took a deep sip of cocoa, then leaned forward, eyes shining. Do you really watch for Bigfoot? Lauren almost choked on her drink. She opened her mouth to interrupt, to tell him not to ask something so bold. But Earl only chuckled, a low, warm sound that filled the room. I watch for everything, he said. Bigfoot included. Have you ever seen him? Cody whispered. Earl tilted his head slightly, considering. I've seen shadows, shapes moving in places they shouldn't. I found tracks that didn't fit anything I knew. Heard sounds at night deep, echoing. Nothing like a bear or cougar. He paused, looking thoughtfully into the fire. But did I see Bigfoot? That depends on what you mean by seeing. Cody didn't seem confused or disappointed. He looked enthralled, as though this answer held more possibility than a simple yes or no. Lauren studied Earl's face in the firelight. His eyes were a little sunken, rimmed with lines carved by time and wind, but they were steady. He didn't look like someone lost in fantasies or delusions. He looked like a man who had spent years paying attention to the woods, to sounds most people ignored, to details that spoke only to those who lived alone long enough to learn their language. The conversation unraveled slowly, comfortably. Earl spoke of the forest in a way Lauren had never heard. He talked about the quiet patterns of wildlife, the shift of seasons, the marked storms left on the land. He described a night when he'd seen a towering silhouette between two pines, just as the moon rose, how it moved too smoothly, too silently to be human. He described a morning when he found a trail of footprints, nearly twice the size of his own, each one pressed deep into fresh snow. He never claimed certainty. He spoke with a measured voice, as though all he wanted, all he ever wanted, was to observe. Time passed unnoticed. Cody asked questions with a child's earnestness, and Earl answered each one patiently. Lauren watched them, her heart warming unexpectedly. She wasn't sure when the shift had happened, but at some point her fear had eased into curiosity, and curiosity into a quiet sense of trust. Not complete, but enough to let her breathe more freely. After a while, Earl rose from his chair and stepped to a shelf, retrieving a small wooden carving. It was shaped like a tall figure with enormous feet and wide shoulders. He handed it to Cody. Here, thought you might like this. Cody stared at the figure, his mouth slightly open. You're giving this to me? Earl shrugged, a soft smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. I've carved a lot of them. Nice to see one appreciated. Cody held the figurine as though it were made of glass. Lauren saw something flicker across Earl's expression, a quiet, almost aching gentleness. The evening deepened. The fire crackled. The cabin settled. The air warmed. The forest outside grew dark, but inside, everything felt still and safe. When Lauren finally realized how long they had been sitting, she was surprised. Time felt different here, unhurried, as though the forest didn't measure hours the way the city did. She glanced at Earl and said softly, "Thank you for all of this." Earl nodded, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "It's good to have company. Makes the place feel more like a home." Lauren wasn't sure why those words struck her the way they did, but she felt a heaviness in them, a loneliness layered so deeply it had become part of the man himself. When they finally stepped outside again, preparing to return the way they came, she realized she no longer felt as though she were standing near a stranger in a remote forest. She felt as though she had glimpsed someone's inner world, someone who had chosen solitude, but still carried traces of a life lived with love and loss. As Earl guided them back toward the trail, the forest no longer seemed menacing. It felt alive, full of quiet stories the kind only someone like Earl might hear. And for the first time since stepping off the main path, Lauren didn't feel lost. She felt gently, cautiously found. The forest looked different on their way back, although Lauren could not immediately name what had changed. The shadows were the same long strokes pulled between the trunks. The air still held that cool dampness that clung to the moss and bark, and the path was still narrow and reaching, winding deeper through the evergreens before looping back toward where they had come. But something in the way she walked felt altered, softened, as though the earlier edge of fear that had tightened her breath had melted into a cautious calm. Earl walked ahead, steady and sure-footed, guiding them with gentle nods toward safer routes and flatter stones. Cody walked between them, swinging the wooden figurine from one hand, occasionally lifting it up as if showing it new corners of the forest. Lauren found herself studying Earl as they walked. His steps were unhurried but purposeful, and the way he glanced at the trees, quick, attentive, familiar, made it clear he was a man who had spent years learning the language of the land. Yet there was something else in his posture now, a subtle tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there inside the cabin, as though stepping outside had placed a weight back onto him that the firelight had briefly lifted. She wondered what it meant, but the thought drifted away as Cody ran ahead to inspect a patch of mushrooms growing in a ring near a fallen tree. Earl slowed so the boy could keep within sight. When they reached the clearing where the dense pines gave way to broader trunks, Earl paused and turned slightly toward Lauren. His expression was neither guarded nor open, more like someone standing on the edge of a decision. The soft hush of the forest surrounded them, waiting. Cody was crouched several yards ahead, humming to himself while drawing lines in the dirt with a pine twig. "You two must be tired," Earl said quietly. "We can stop for a moment if you like." He gestured toward a moss-covered log that curved along the edge of the clearing like an old backbone. Lauren sat, grateful for the chance to rest. Cody wandered closer and sat beside her, still clasping the carved figure, brushing dirt off its feet with the thumb of his free hand. Earl remained standing at first, looking toward the trees as though expecting something, maybe memory, maybe sound. Then, after a long moment, he sank down onto the opposite end of the log, hands dangling loosely between his knees. The quiet stretched between them, not uncomfortable, but full, as though the forest itself breathed along with them. Lauren waited, sensing something in the air, a shift in the man that felt important. She saw him draw in a slow breath, his chest rising and falling as if gathering strength. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than she had heard it before, almost careful. "I wasn't always out here," he said, not looking directly at her, but at a point somewhere between the branches overhead. "Most people think I'm crazy, living alone in the woods at my age. But there was a time when I lived in town, had a house, a wife, neighbors who waved when I walked the dog." Lauren nodded, urging him silently to continue. Cody, sensing the seriousness of Earl's tone, grew still beside her, the figurine resting gently in his lap. "My wife's name was Margaret," Earl said. "She loved these woods more than I did even. We used to hike together, every season, every trail. She could name half the plants out here by smell alone." A faint smile touched his mouth, but it faltered. "She passed away about 10 years ago. Cancer. Fast. Too fast." The forest absorbed his words, the way a room holds the echo of a confession. Lauren's breath caught softly in her chest. She hadn't expected him to share something so deeply personal, not after knowing them only a few hours. But there was a sincerity in his voice, a truth that reached further than simple storytelling. It felt like something he had been holding for so long that to speak it again offered a strange relief. "I couldn't stay in the house after that," he said. "Every room felt empty, even when I stood inside it. People tried to help, brought casseroles, asked if I needed anything. But grief doesn't work like that. It's not loud enough for people to notice unless it breaks you completely. And it's not quiet enough to ignore either. It just sits there, like fog. Lauren swallowed, her throat tight. "I'm sorry," she murmured, though she knew how hollow those words often sounded. But Earl nodded faintly, accepting the sentiment for what it was. "So I came here," he continued, "packed what I could, sold the rest. Bought this cabin off a friend who thought I lost my mind." He gave a dry chuckle. "Maybe I did, for a while. But the forest, it's patient in a way people aren't. It doesn't rush you, doesn't tell you how to grieve. It just makes room for whatever you're carrying." Lauren felt Cody lean slightly against her side. She put an arm around him, though her gaze never left Earl. She could feel the trembling honesty in his voice, could sense the loneliness threading through each word, woven like an old scar into the fabric of his days. "People think I came out here for Bigfoot," Earl said. "And I let them think it. It's easier than explaining the truth." He looked down at his hands, rubbing a thumb along the calloused ridge of his palm. "Truth is, the legends gave me something to hold on to. After Margaret died, I needed a reason to get up in the morning. The search gave me that. The idea that maybe, just maybe, there was something out there still undiscovered. Something the world hadn't taken away yet." Lauren listened, struck by the rawness beneath his steady voice. This wasn't the idealistic rambling of a man chasing mythical creatures for thrill. It was the confession of someone who had needed wonder, the way others needed medication, or prayer, something that kept the emptiness from swallowing him whole. "You're not crazy," she said softly. "People grieve in different ways." Earl's eyes lifted to her at last, and she saw something shine there. Gratitude, perhaps, or simple relief at being understood rather than dismissed. "Most folks don't think so," he said. "I don't get many visitors. Not anymore." He fell silent again. The forest air seemed to press closer, drawing them into its quiet hush. Cody shifted, adjusting the figurine in his hands. "I think it's cool," he said earnestly, his voice high and sincere. "All the maps and carvings you made. It's like you're a forest detective." The comment made Earl chuckle, a genuine smile tugging at his mouth. "A forest detective," he repeated. "I like that." Lauren felt warmth bloom in her chest. There was something powerful in the way Cody bridged gaps, how his simple kindness softened the spaces between people. Earl looked lighter now, as though a small weight had lifted from him just by being seen. "Are you lonely?" Cody asked suddenly. Lauren stiffened slightly, but Earl didn't seem offended. Instead, he considered the question, as if it deserved a real answer. "Sometimes," he admitted. "Sometimes it gets quiet out here, quieter than a person needs. But the forest keeps me company. And the things I'm searching for," he lifted a hand, gesturing vaguely toward the trees, "well, they keep my heart beating." Lauren felt an ache in her throat. She recognized in his words an echo of her own exhaustion, her own fear of becoming invisible in her life, of being swallowed by work, routine, silence. She wondered when she had become so familiar with loneliness herself, even with a child beside her. They sat in quiet for a while longer, the forest humming softly around them. Lauren found herself glancing toward Earl's cabin in the distance, thinking of the warmth inside, of the maps and carvings and memories layered gently throughout the space. He lived in a world shaped by grief, but also by hope, a hope fragile and persistent as the first breath of spring. Cody tugged at her sleeve. "Mom," he whispered, "can we come back sometime? To visit Mr. Earl? I like him." Lauren looked at Earl, whose gaze drifted away as though he didn't want to intrude on a conversation not meant for him. She saw then how truly alone he had been, not in a dramatic, visible way, but in the subtle way that happens when days stretch on without another voice to anchor you. She thought of the way he had spoken of Margaret, the care in every detail of the cabin, the quiet ache beneath his stories. "Yes," she murmured to Cody, her eyes still on Earl. "I think we can." Earl looked up then. The surprise in his face was faint, but unmistakable, softening the harsh lines time had carved into his features. "You don't have to," he began, almost apologetically. "I know the woods aren't—" "We want to," Lauren said gently, "if you'd like that." For a moment Earl didn't speak. The forest seemed to still around them, as though holding its breath. Then he nodded once, slowly, a small tremor running through the motion. Yes, I'd like that very much." Cody beamed. Earl looked at him and smiled back in a way that was unguarded and almost tender, as though something fragile inside him had stirred awake. They resumed walking soon after, but everything felt different now. The forest didn't loom or threaten. It wrapped around them in a quiet, steady way, its shadows softer and its sounds familiar. Earl led them toward the main trail, but Lauren sensed he was not simply guiding them through the woods anymore. He was connected to them now in a subtle but unmistakable way, a thin thread of trust and something like belonging. As they walked, Cody talked animatedly about the figurine, about how he wanted to draw Earl's cabin, about how maybe next time Earl could teach him how to carve something. Earl listened with a patience that made Lauren's heart twist. She saw in him a kindness that had nothing to do with monsters or mysteries. It was a simple, human kindness, born of solitude and memory. When the main path finally came into view, a broad streak of sunlight cutting through the trees, Lauren felt both relief and something like regret. They were returning to their world, but part of her remained behind in the clearing, in the warmth of the cabin, in the quiet truth Earl had shared. Cody waved the figurine proudly. Earl smiled and said, "Take care of that little fellow. He's seen more of the forest than most people ever will." "I will," Cody promised. Earl paused before stepping back into the trees. "You two come back whenever you want," he said. "My door is always open." Lauren nodded. She wanted to say something more. Something that would tell him how much this unexpected day had meant. But the words stuck, too soft to speak. Instead, she offered a warm, grateful smile. Earl seemed to understand. They watched as he vanished into the forest, moving with the steady ease of someone who belonged entirely to the land. And as mother and son began their journey back toward camp, Lauren felt something new flicker inside her, a sense that they had not just wandered off the trail, but into the beginning of something quietly, unexpectedly meaningful. 2 weeks passed, though to Cody it felt more like a month, and to Lauren it felt like only a handful of breaths strung together by work shifts, school drop-offs, lunches packed at dawn, and quiet evenings when she caught herself staring through the kitchen window at the dark tree line beyond the apartment buildings. She had always liked the forest, its steadiness, its quiet, but now it pulled at her with a different gravity. Not because of Bigfoot, or mystery, or the strange thrill of wandering off the marked trail. It was because of Earl. He returned to her thoughts in small moments, uninvited, yet welcome. The soft rasp of his chuckle, the way he had looked at Cody as if the boy were a spark of light in a dark room, the gentle tremor in his voice when he spoke of Margaret. There had been no expectation in him, no plea, no attempt to hold on to them. But there had been hope, thin and trembling, like a thread stretched across a long winter. And Lauren had felt it tug at her even after they had walked away from him. Cody talked about him constantly. At breakfast, he wondered aloud whether Earl had found anything new. On the drive to school, he asked whether the cabin stayed warm at night, whether the dog slept beside the fire, whether Earl ever got bored in the quiet. He showed his wooden figurine to his classmates, explaining with great seriousness that it had been made by a real forest ranger who had seen shadows bigger than bears. His classroom drawing assignments were suddenly full of mountains and cabins and tall trees, and Lauren noticed that Earl always appeared in the background carrying firewood, pointing toward something Cody had drawn off to the side, sitting with the dog beneath a pine. It wasn't obsession. It was a gentle connection blooming in a child who had longed for guidance from someone who saw him, listened to him, and spoke to him with patience. And so the second visit became inevitable. On Thursday night, after her shift ended early, Lauren found herself standing in the grocery store aisle, staring at the ingredients for a pie she hadn't baked in years. Her grandmother's recipe surfaced in her memory notes, scribbled in the margins, the faint scent of cinnamon on creased paper, the warmth of Sunday afternoons when the oven hummed and laughter filled the small kitchen where she'd grown up. She hadn't made the pie since her grandmother died. The thought struck her with an ache that was both tender and sharp. She bought the ingredients. Back home, Cody was already bouncing with anticipation. When she told him they were visiting Earl that weekend, he spun around the living room with a noise somewhere between a cheer and a gasp. Then he knelt beside his backpack and began cramming items into it: his sketchbook, his flashlight, his favorite pencil worn to a stub, a handful of trail mix he thought Earl might like, and the wooden figurine he refused to leave behind. Lauren reminded him to slow down, and he did, but with the restless energy of someone who had been waiting for something he wasn't sure he would be allowed to hope for. They left early Saturday morning, the sky still pale and streaked with the thin light of dawn. The drive felt different this time, not a retreat from exhaustion, but a journey toward something quietly meaningful. Lauren glanced at Cody in the rearview mirror. He was holding the pie tin carefully in his lap, as though it were a newborn animal. Behind him, propped against the seat, sat a gift bag containing the wool hat they had chosen for Earl and a blank leather-bound notebook with thick ivory pages. "You think he'll like it?" Cody asked for the third time. "Yes," Lauren said, smiling. "I think he'll love it." "And the hat?" "He'll definitely love the hat." "And the pie?" "He might cry when he tastes it," she said. Cody laughed so hard he snorted, then pressed a hand over his mouth in embarrassment. The forest welcomed them like an old friend, its green shadows layered with familiarity. The air smelled of cedar and cold earth, and when they finally reached the narrow turnoff that led toward Earl's hidden path, Lauren felt her heartbeat shift, steadying, settling, as though she were crossing into a place where the world exhaled. They followed the winding footpath until the cabin came into view. Smoke rose lazily from the chimney, and something about that single, looping tendril made Lauren's throat tighten. The porch was swept clean, the old wooden chair positioned to face the clearing. And there he was. Earl stood near the steps, as if he had been waiting long enough to memorize every sound the forest made. His shoulders were squared, his posture straight, but his eyes softened the moment he recognized them. That gentle tremor she had seen in him weeks before flickered again, but this time it was tempered by something warmer, something like joy, though he held it carefully, like a delicate object. "Well," he said, his voice catching faintly, "would you look at that? I thought maybe I dreamed you too." Cody sprinted to him, stopping only when he remembered some invisible rule about personal space. Earl crouched a little to meet him and ruffled his hair with the gentlest sweep of his hand. Cody beamed. "I brought you something," Cody announced, thrusting the gift bag forward with such force the handles almost tore. Earl took it slowly, as though he feared it might turn to ash if held too tightly. Lauren stepped forward, offering the pie. We made this yesterday. It's an old family recipe. Earl's eyes widened. You didn't have to. We wanted to, she said. He looked at both of them then, his gaze shifting between mother and son. For a moment he seemed unable to speak. Lauren thought she saw the glint of tears gathering at the edges of his eyes, but he blinked them away, clearing his throat roughly. Well, come in. I've been getting things ready. Inside, the cabin looked different too, not drastically, but noticeably. Earl had tidied everything. The maps were stacked neatly. The wooden figurines had been arranged in careful rows. A blanket had been folded and placed over the back of a chair. Fresh kindling sat near the stove, and the kettle was already warming. It was as if he had prepared for them with the quiet diligence of someone who had rarely had a reason to prepare for anything at all. Cody wandered straight to the row of carvings, marveling at each one. Earl watched him for a moment, then gave Lauren a small, shy smile. I made a few new ones, he said, just in case he came back. Her chest tightened once more, not painfully, but with a tenderness she hadn't expected to feel for a man who had been a stranger only weeks before. They spent the day in the forest together. Earl showed Cody how to identify tracks, not mythical ones, but the everyday signs left by deer, raccoons, and rabbits. Cody listened with reverence, repeating each fact aloud until he had memorized it. They walked along a ridge where Earl had once seen an enormous silhouette move between the trees. He didn't embellish or sensationalize the memory. He spoke as someone recalling a quiet, personal moment. Lauren walked slightly behind them, watching the two figures, one tall and slow-moving, one small and darting with excitement, and felt something settle in her heart. It was not romance in any conventional sense. There was no flutter, no longing, no delicate illusions. What she felt was deeper, quieter, something like gratitude shaped into warmth. Earl treated Cody with a patience that was rare in the world. He saw him not as a child to be tolerated, but as a person worth listening to. And Cody responded with a sincerity that made Lauren ache with the beauty of it. When they returned to the cabin in the late afternoon, Earl built a fire outside, stacking the logs in a perfect teepee shape that caught flame easily. Cody roasted marshmallows until they blistered, and Earl laughed when the boy got sticky strands of sugar all over his fingers. The sound surprised all of them. Rich, full, unguarded. It was a sound that hadn't echoed in these woods for years. The sun dipped behind the tree line, painting the sky with streaks of pink and gold. Lauren sat beside the fire, feeling its warmth seeping into her skin. Earl sat across from her, his face lit by the flames, his expression relaxed in a way she hadn't seen before. "You've brought life back to this place," he said quietly. "I didn't realize how quiet it had gotten until you two showed up again." Lauren shook her head. "You've given us something too." "Like what?" he asked, genuinely curious. "A reminder," she said, "that the world is bigger than work and noise, that there's beauty in being still. And for Cody," she looked at her son curled beside the fire, his eyes drooping with satisfied exhaustion. "You've given him someone to look up to." Earl's breath caught. He looked down at his hands, tracing the grain of the wooden armrest. "I'm not sure I deserve that." "You do," she said simply. The fire crackled, the forest hummed, and Earl lifted his gaze, his expression both humbled and grateful. Cody stirred then, rubbing his eyes. "Mom, can we come back again, soon?" Lauren smiled and smoothed his hair. "Yes, we can." Earl exhaled slowly, the kind of exhale someone makes when the weight they've carried for years eases at last. "You two have a home here," he said softly. "Anytime you want it." They stayed until the stars appeared in the gaps between the pines. When they finally rose to leave, Earl walked them to the edge of the clearing, stopping where the trees grew thick again, Cody hugged him without hesitation, wrapping small arms around the man's waist. Earl froze at first, startled, then gently placed a hand on the back of the boy's head. It was an embrace full of meaning, an exchange of something unspoken but undeniably profound. Lauren met Earl's eyes. "We'll see you soon." He nodded once, slowly. "I'll be here." As they disappeared into the woods, following the narrow earthen path back toward the world beyond the forest, Earl remained standing at the edge of the clearing, watching them with a softened expression that the trees themselves seemed to echo. For the first time in years, he did not feel the pull of loneliness as night approached. He felt something else, something warm, something hopeful, something like belonging. And in the quiet heart of the forest, illuminated only by starlight and the faint embers of the fire they had shared, Earl Thompson understood that he had not found Bigfoot or proof of a legend, but he had found a family, or the beginning of one, and that was a miracle greater than anything he had searched for in all his years alone. If this story touched you, make sure to subscribe for more. Watch our next videos, share this one with someone who needs it, and stay with us for the stories that matter.